Hi, my name is Adi Wiezel. I'm a PhD candidate in social psychology at Arizona State University. And a lot of my research focuses on kind of the intersection between social psychology and political science in a subfield called political psychology. So I recently published a paper with my collaborator and friend, John Wagner, who is another graduate student at University of New Mexico. Right? We know that there's an increased level of what we call political polarization. And often when we talk about political polarization, we can mean one of two things. One of the things that we sometimes refer to is people's actual attitude differences. And that's actually not as high as people tend to presume it is. So a lot of what we talk about tends to be this animus that we have between parties. So if you're a Democrat, it's how much you maybe dislike Republicans. If you're a Republican, it's maybe how much you dislike Democrats and how positive you feel about your own party. So we were kind of interested in looking at investigating this question and what the actual breakdown is. So what are people's feelings in the American populace actually like toward these different parties? So what we did is we took data from the American National Election Studies, which is this long longitudinal study that's been collecting data since the 1940s, right around every 4 years in the election cycle. And we were kind of interested in seeing, for the people that self-identify as partisans, how do they feel toward each party? So usually people measure this using a feeling thermometer. So 0 is like the coolest feelings, 100 is the warmest feelings. That's a very positive feeling toward a party. And we wanted to see how can we actually classify where Americans fall? Because it turns out there's a couple of different theories about how this should look. One theory, known as classical affective polarization, as we like to call it, seems to focus on this idea that people are affectively politically polarized insofar as they like or feel warm toward their own party, right? So if you're a Republican, that's the Republican Party. If you're a Democrat, that's the Democrat Party. And how negative you feel toward the opposite party, right? So if you're a Republican, that would be Democrats. If you're Democrats, that would be Republicans. And those two things are thought to operate in conjunction. So you should be kind of high both on your level of out-party animus and high on your level of in-party affinity. And we were kind of curious because there's other theories that tend to say, well, let's actually focus mostly on the animosity part, like how negative do people feel toward the out-party? And that would actually suggest a couple of different combinations, right? Not just people that are high on feeling negative toward the out party, but also maybe not feeling positive toward their own in party. That isn't a necessary requirement of that theoretical perspective. So what we did is we took these data from 2020 and we started categorizing people into these different quadrants. And one of the things that we found, not a big difference between Democrats and Republicans, which is interesting. And the vast majority of partisans, about 85%, seem to live in this space where they like their own party and dislike the out party. So that's kind of the classic political polarization approach. But another fairly large contingent of 8% of the populace, roughly, actually dislikes both parties. And interestingly enough, about 4% actually liked both parties. Now that would be a position that's not well predicted by either theoretical approach. But what's interesting about that group is we weren't just interested in looking at the numbers. We were interested in seeing how these changed over time, so between 2016 and 2020. And what we saw is generally an increase in these, what we called classically polarized partisans. So folks that like their own in-party and dislike this. So there's been an increase in that to the decrease of people that dislike both parties, double dislikers, and like both parties, double likers, between 2016 and 2020. But what else we were interested in is, well, you know, feelings are often thought to be for things like behavior or maybe linked to other kinds of attitudes. So we were also interested in seeing what are the implications for these different affective groups in terms of their associations with variables like political trust. And what we ended up finding is that actually it's those double likers, those people that liked both parties relatively highly, that those were the folks that actually had the highest levels of political trust. And that level of trust, despite the fact that their numbers went down between 2016 and 2020, actually increased. So they showed even higher levels of trust.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And then the double dislikers, you know, tended to be lower than average. So it sort of panned out how you'd expect, right? So double dislikers, people that disliked both their in-party and their political out-party, those folks tended to have lower levels of trust. You know, the people kind of Goldilocks in the middle of like being, so folks that were sort of those classically polarized partisans, individuals that like their in-party and dislike their out-party, those were somewhere in the middle. But it was those double likers, which is this theoretically interesting group that's not well explained by some of our extant theories of partisan affect that seem to show those really interesting relationships with political trust.